Time to get started. So I've got a couple of announcements to make as we get started. First of all, I want more clarification from Ellen Vanderstelt. They've been on a trip. You went to the Dakotas? South Dakota, you got to Mount Rushmore. And then some of them are still gone, but some have came back. Now, you said it was a great trip, but parts of it were painful.
The driving part.
Was it like having Sam in the vehicle for all those hours? Or Violet that was so painful? What's that? Is that true, Violet, or do you think she's just being... Oh, you're agreeing with her? You were a pain? No? Okay. Wow, she's got you indoctrinated. All right. The other thing I need to just share with you, and I don't know, some of you know this, probably most of you do not. We do not have functioning in the kitchen or in this room or in this little room or Scott's office for that matter. We don't have air conditioning functioning in this space. Dan and Diane Collins, Dan is a retired HVAC guy, and he's been doing the system for us, and everything is here. I mean, the compressors are out there, but it's not all hooked up, and they're gone for a month. And so I called Dan yesterday and said, we got some issues here. We got Bible school coming up and a lot of things. Monday morning, he's going to call a group in the Tri-Cities that he knows and see if they can come down here. I think it's going to be very difficult to get someone here, given we're going to be in the hottest week in the last... I've been here for 25 years, and I can remember one day, decades ago now, when it was 115. There was a day when it was 115. I think it was the week of Bible school. And I just remember it was like in the afternoon, everybody just sort of wilted. So I don't know whether we're going to get service, but hopefully something can be worked out, because it is a bit warm in here. Yesterday I came down in the afternoon and I opened up those doors, and we have air conditioning in the foyer and in the sanctuary, of course, so I turned on the air conditioning in the foyer, closed off some rooms, and it's cooler than in the kitchen. It's over 80 in there. So it did some good, but it is pretty warm, and that's where we're at. So I just want you to know that if you're feeling warm and in an hour, if you're feeling really warm, there's not much I can do about it. We're not trying to torture you. We just don't have air conditioning right now. Seaside, you want to be on the family camp committee? Your name was brought up in a little meeting I had this morning. Someone said, you'd be good for the family camp committee. And I said, I think you'd be willing to do it. So Tuesday at 6 p.m., we're going to meet here at the church. Oh, well, you're off by 5. I know your schedule. Basically, they want some young people on the committee because they think young people have new ideas. And the family camp committee needs new ideas because it's the same group and doing it for many, many years. So there is going to be a meeting this Tuesday at 6 p.m. We'll probably meet in the foyer because we have air conditioning out there. And it's a family camp committee meeting. And we do family camp at Camp Ocana, and it's Labor Day weekend. And it is a really good event. It's a fun event. If you would like to serve on the family camp committee this year, we are open to different folks and new ideas and different suggestions. So it's a Friday, Saturday, Sunday event, and again, it's Labor Day weekend, and it's usually well attended. So I don't have any other announcements. So the Ziers are with us today. That's Beth, and you got 3 kids I see, and that's Courtney back there, and they're with Wycliffe. Good to see you, Eddie. I'm glad you made it back.
Thank you.
How was Ukiah?
Pardon me?
How was Ukiah? Did you get up there?
A lot cooler than here.
A lot cooler than here?
Yeah, pretty nice.
All right.
Beautiful day.
And you missed the announcement. We don't have air conditioning in here yet.
Oh, okay.
So-
Back to Gaia.
Yeah. Actually, I looked on my weather app. So is it Tuesday? It's supposed to be 117 or 18 here. Seaside, Oregon's going to be 70 degrees. Yeah, that's probably what everybody else is thinking too. So you'd go down there and be packed out. But it's going to be very nice on the seaside. The Oregon coast is going to be pretty nice. But anyway. All right, well, welcome. So today we are, the notes, if you need notes, they're right in front of Cheryl Lynn. We did have Bill Porfili in charge of passing out notes. We did such a bad job at it, we've taken that away from him and put Cheryl Lynn in charge. Actually, now that you're retired, now you're both retired, we haven't seen you in a couple of weeks. You've been up on your property, I assume? How's the weather up there?
Warm.
Warm? Okay. So we are on the second page of those notes. Again, this is Worldview and Lesson 10 entitled Abortion in America. But before we look at that, I just want to read to you a couple of paragraphs from an article from this week. If you follow the news, you've probably heard this, you're probably aware of this. Some of you don't follow the news. Some of you who don't follow the news live in my house, so that's how I know that. And then others like Seaside, I mean, he's really into the news, so he's pretty informed. But I thought I'd just read this to you. It just shows where we're at as a culture, and it's like 2 + 2 = 5. It just doesn't compute, it doesn't add up, it doesn't make sense, it defies biological realities, but it is where we're at. So I'm thinking of Laurel Hubbard, and Laurel Hubbard is from New Zealand, and Laurel Hubbard is transgender, so Laurel is biologically male and is a weightlifter. And I believe Laurel is now 43 years old, and the transition or the change in designation took place at 34 or 35 years of age. So Laurel has gone as a man for most of, I will say, his life, because Laurel is biologically male and will always be biologically male, and is a member of the New Zealand Olympic team as a woman's super heavyweight division. Have you heard of this story? Let me just read a couple paragraphs here. A New Zealand weightlifter who has competed in men's events in the past will become the first transgender competitor to qualify to be on the country's women's weightlifting team for Tokyo in 2020. The report pointed out that in 2015, the International Olympic Committee changed its rules to allow transgender athletes to compete as long as their testosterone level is below a certain level and maintained for a year. The determining criteria is at least 5 times more than a biological woman. So a male has a certain level of testosterone that's much higher than a woman. Women, of course, have testosterone and men have estrogen, but testosterone is the male hormone. How much higher? Anybody know how much higher a male testosterone is to a woman? 18 times higher. And that's what gives men their physical strength. It's also, the major, at puberty, what creates bone density and muscle mass. And so the person we're talking about here, until 7 or 8 years ago, had normal male testosterone with all the advantages that brings throughout his entire life. Now, his testosterone is around 5 times higher than an average woman, still, because he's on testosterone blockers, but he still has a higher level than a woman would. The Guardian, citing IOC guidelines, reported that athletes who transition from male to female, again, I mean, that's euphemistic language. That's language that isn't true. I think you just did you acknowledge that? Athletes who transition from male to female. We know what that means, right? You change your pronoun, you change your title, you change your name, you go on the cross-sex hormones. But at a genetic level, you can't undo the XY, right? So someday, when Laurel is dead, if 300 years in the future, if an archaeological dig somehow dug up Laurel, and they asked the question, was this individual male or female, and they scientifically, what would they determine? Male, right? And how would they determine that? Yeah, bone structure, bone density, and I mean, they might do genetic testing. Laurel would be male. So I just think it's not, even though this is the way we talk today, it's just not true to transition from male to female. That's impossible biologically speaking. They're allowed to compete in events without surgically removing the testes. Okay? The paper reported that some recent studies show power gained during male puberty can last. I mean, not a big surprise there, honestly. Hubbard lifted 628 pounds in 2 lifts to qualify in the women's super heavyweight division. She won a silver medal at the 2017 World Championships and a gold in the 2019 Pacific Games in Samoa. Now, she hasn't competed as much since then because she had an injury, but she's now healed from that. New Zealand Olympic Committee Chief Karen Smith said, "It's clear Hubbard has met all the criteria to compete in Tokyo." Then here's a quote. "We acknowledge that gender identity in sport is a highly sensitive and complex issue requiring a balance between human rights and fairness in the field of play." How would you describe what I just read? Let me read that again. "We acknowledge that gender identity in sport is a highly sensitive and complex issue requiring a balance between human rights and fairness in the field of play."
It's not complex, it's simple.
Yeah, this is doublespeak. This is...
It's not fair to all the women who aren't going to pedal because they've got a boy.
Yeah, a better statement would have been, instead of human rights, women's rights, right? Because this biological male has already cost women a place on the podium. And I don't know how weightlifting works for Olympics, but I do know whether there's 2 lifters per country or 3 lifters per country. Let's assume there's 3. Someone in New Zealand finished 4th, right? Someone in New Zealand right now is not on the Olympic team because a biological male took her spot. That's a reality.
I saw the news notice, they send 1 per weight class, and the lady that this transgender plays had broken a bunch of records, had set records, and then this person beat all her records, and they said, you either need to retire or lose 18 kilos in 3 months to make a lower weight class.
Yeah. So thank you. I didn't know that. So only 1 person per weight class, which kind of makes sense actually, because you do have all the different weight classes. So there's a woman in New Zealand who is understandably crushed, and I would assume pretty angry and pretty bitter over this. Although I'm amazed how, I think it's because of the pressure exerted on a lot of athletes, how many women athletes seem hesitant to really demonstrate justified anger over some of this. Okay, by the way, this kind of talk, it's highly sensitive, you know, this is the sort of stuff that comes up in abortion too. You know, they don't talk honestly. It's women's reproductive health rights and this sort of thing. It's not, It's never honest about what abortion actually is. As the New Zealand team, we have a strong culture of hospitality and inclusion and respect for all. Now, here's one athlete who has spoken. Belgium's Anna, I don't know how to speak Dutch, Van Bellingen, who will likely compete against Hubbard, said the New Zealanders' presence would be like a bad joke for women competitors. Life-changing opportunities are missed for some athletes, medals and Olympic qualifications, and then these words, and we are powerless. So here's a woman weightlifter, an Olympian, saying, and we are powerless. Now, there's a certain irony in that, given that she's a powerlifter, right? So how sad this is. Of course, this debate is taking place in a broader context of discrimination against transgender people, and that is why the question is never free of ideology.
The problem there is sacrificing women's rights for transgender rights.
Yes.
It's just that.
And it's another reminder, the LGBTQ plus community, all these individuals, so to speak, are in bed together, but the alliance doesn't really work well. And between the L and the T, you really see this. Because the T is a direct threat to the L in a lot of ways, not just in sports, but using bathrooms, using locker rooms, what are traditionally women's colleges, where you now have transgender individuals who are, accepted into the women's college. So the T and the L they don't fit well. And the only reason that there is this alliance, frankly, if we're going to just speak honestly, is that they have a bigger enemy. And that's basically traditional morality. And they've come together. It's like World War II, and it's not a bad analogy. I mean, Roosevelt and Churchill got in bed with Stalin because Hitler was considered worse, right? And that's, so in other words, if the LGBTQ community actually totally conquers the culture, as they very well might, I believe that. I do not believe that they will ultimately conquer the culture, because eventually this will collapse, but it might take a long time. But when that happens, if they conquer the culture, the LGBTQ community, I think, will splinter, because their agendas, and they just don't fit well. And this is an example of that.
Something that totally negates their scientific argument is that nothing is happening in the reverse. We don't see transgender men clamoring to compete with men.
Yes.
It's just, the fallacy, it's just beyond ridiculous. But then again, logic is a white supremacist thing.
Mm-hmm. You all understand what Marilyn just said, right? You don't have the other thing happening where you've got biological girls who transition to boys, and then they're going to take people like Usain Bolt off the podium in the 100-meter dash, right? And of course, he's retired now, but he's considered, I think, maybe the best sprinter in history. Or Alex and Felix, who I've mentioned before, she's a woman Olympian. She's won more medals than Usain Bolt, heavily decorated. And she runs the 200 and the 400. And there are 300 high school boys in America who can beat her time. And that doesn't include all the college runners or the Olympic runners. Just 300, and it doesn't include all the Chinese runners and the European high school boys. Just in the United States, there are 300 who can beat. She's the fastest woman in the world. And it just shows you that this is so upside down and backwards. But it really is like 2 + 2 now equals 5. It's bizarre. All right, but that's not for today, but I'll just continue to, as you know, I encounter those things and just bring those up. We are today on the section here in your notes, abortion and minorities. So let me just start reading to you. And I think this is interesting. I think it's worthwhile to know this. Black women make up only 12% of women of childbearing age, but they account for 30% of all abortions. Hispanic women constitute only 13% of this same group, but suffer 20% of the total abortions in America. Together, these two minority groups account for 25% of women of childbearing age in America, but account for 55% of the total babies aborted in the country. In other words, minority women are aborting at more than twice the rate of white women, and the leading cause of death in the black community is abortion. Isn't that sad? The leading cause of death in the black community is abortion. And in specific cities, the data is even more shocking. 57% of black pregnancies in New York City end in abortion, according to a 2009 data from the Department of Health. For white women, the number is 20%, and for the city overall, it's about 39%. And the source for that is given there. It's a little book, but it's a good book. And this just, and I realize that Planned Parenthood, if you follow these issues, Planned Parenthood has distanced themselves from their own history, which is kind of interesting if you think about it, because right now, there's a whole segment of our culture that wants us to reckon with our history, right? And they want to draw attention to every bad aspect of American history, and then there is some bad, to be sure. But Planned Parenthood, do you know the background of where the organization comes from? And Margaret Sanger? And eugenics. Yeah, so much of this stuff does go back to what ended it was Nazism, honestly. Eugenics was a pretty powerful movement in the United States in the early part of the 20th century. And eugenics, of course, literally means good genes. And so, of course, this is highly racist, but the idea of someone like Margaret Sanger, who was an overt racist and is the founder of Planned Parenthood, her concept was we need to get rid of bad genes. And so we need to use abortion as an avenue of doing this. And so we need to really push abortion, and we need to push it in the minority communities because we want to get rid of those individuals. And that's part of the historic record. And it's amazing how many American politicians in the 20s, for instance, were pro-eugenics. And again, what ended that was Nazi Germany took this broader movement and really ran with it. And of course, the result of that was the Holocaust. And so there was great shame after all of that, and they sort of just washed their hands of the whole eugenics idea. But that is where the modern abortion movement, if you go back to its origins and beginnings, that's where you have to go. And some of you might know more about that history than I do. Is there anything that I've missed or misrepresented even?
I heard that when the Nazis were sitting down trying to codify their policies and everything, and then all of a sudden it dawned on them there was a whole bunch of stuff here in America that was just cut and paste, and then just changed the name. Where they went, they didn't have to write the whole document.
Yeah. I mean, this attaches to someone like Woodrow Wilson, you know, a pretty famous American president during the First World War. And Woodrow Wilson was an extremely racist individual. And so this got into the high levels of the elites in our culture who were believing these things and pushing policies that today we would say are really abhorrent. And Planned Parenthood has, in the last year or two, I mean, they have acknowledged some of this, and they've really tried to wash their hands of Margaret Sanger. They've sort of repudiated her, but that's a very recent development. So, okay. All right. Let me just read this. I don't know if you have this in your notes or not, but I think this is worth considering. The words embryo and fetus, where do those words come from? They come from Latin and Greek. They're Greek and Latin words, and what do they mean? They mean literally young one. Okay? And that just changes your thinking a little bit here, because sometimes we'll use those words as if, almost as if to suggest that it's not a human being, it's not a human baby. These are technical terms that simply mean young one, or a young human being in an early stage of development. When scientists speak of a human embryo or fetus, they are not putting it in the category of another species, but are simply using technical terminology for a stage of development, like the words infant, child, adolescent, adult. A human fetus is a young person in the womb. And that comes from Joe Beakey, he's actually a pastor and a Reformed theologian, and pretty good guy. So I have some Bible verses, and I don't know how far we'll get today. I think we'll get through those verses. So let's look at those and try to think together, why is it that the Christian church of all stripes and varieties throughout history until about the last 5 minutes has been opposed to abortion? I don't have it in the notes, but there are quotes, substantial quotes from the church fathers, so going back to the early centuries of the Christian church, where they're speaking about abortion, and they are condemning it as a practice. And so abortion is not new. It's been around forever. And the church has spoken to this issue forever. But here's some biblical passages. So Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image." Now, of course, that is patriarchal language, isn't it? Let us make man in our image. It doesn't say humankind. The word here is Adam in Hebrew, because the word Adam simply means man. But this is also biblical language. But in our culture, there are people who object to this kind of language because they say it's patriarchal, it's male-centered. Yeah, very recent. But when I was in college, I remember 30 years ago, that movement starting. I'm not apologizing for the Bible. I don't think we should apologize for the Bible. I'm acknowledging that there are people who object to Scripture, and they'll object to Scripture at so many different levels, and they'd object right here. So this is biblical language, and we don't apologize for the Bible, but we realize the culture, where the culture's at. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. And so the imago Dei, the Latin phrase for image of God, is applied here equally to male and female. Both men and women are equally created in the image of God. And really, this is the biblical root of why we would say that men and women are equal to one another in terms of value, in terms of worth, in terms of essence, in terms of ontology, in terms of being. So there's an equality of essence, although I would say that there are role distinctions that the Bible gives to us as we work through the story from Genesis to Revelation. But at this point in time, the major observation is that men and women are uniquely created in the image of God. And that is where our worth and our dignity come from.
Important to point out that the likeness is not physical, but spiritual and moral likeness of God.
Yes, God is a spirit. So when we say that we're created in the image of God, we're not to think of God as just, being a gigantic human being in heaven. God is God, we are not. I mean, in the context of Genesis, one thing you would say about the image of God would be that human beings are highly creative. That's part of what it means to be in God's image, because what is God doing in Genesis 1 and 2? He's creating a universe. And how is he doing this? We have a Latin phrase for this. He does establish a family, yes. But yeah, he creates out of nothing, or the Latin phrase is ex nihilo. And so, when we create things, like the banners in the sanctuary that Claire has put together, Claire used, what all did Claire use to make those banners? Did you say stuff? She used a lot of stuff, right? I mean, she used a sewing machine, she used probably a ruler, she used fabric, she had a lot, or if you paint a picture, you've got the canvas, you've got the paintbrushes, you've got the paint. So we create things, but we use pre-existing media to do so. God is in a totally different category. God creates from nothing. So, I mean, it's mind-blowing. So the image of God it means more than that, but for right now, just to point out that to destroy human life in the womb, our major objection to that is rooted in the image of God. That human beings are uniquely created in the image of God. And believe it or not, there's nothing else in creation that is created in the image of God. I mean, I assume that includes angels. Okay? Some other verses. And of course, there isn't a verse in the Bible that says, thou shalt not commit abortion, right?
But the next verse says, what the purpose is to be fruitful and multiply. So
Yes.
that would be a distinct difference there as well.
But there are lots of passages that talk about the uniqueness of human beings, how they're created by God, and so forth. So we're just going to look at some of those. Genesis 25, 21 through 23. This is the birth of Esau and Jacob. Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren. And the Lord granted his prayer, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. And the children struggled together within her. Now, I mean, the word children is significant here. The children struggled together. So they're in her womb, but the Bible refers to them as children. And she said, if it is thus, why is this happening to me? So she went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other, the older shall serve the younger. And so I just read that text because here you have a woman who's pregnant, and the life within her is referred to as these are children, these are boys. And God has a purpose and a destiny for them. Okay? By the way, if you have any observations or thoughts, please feel free to chime in. Exodus 21. It is getting warm in here, isn't it? This is a really interesting text, and I realize there are some differences in terms of how there are some scholarly discussions as to how to exactly translate these words. We're not going to get into that today. We're just going to go with what the ESV has. I think the ESV has this right. But there's an implication in this text. So Exodus 21, beginning in verse 22. When men strive together and hit a pregnant woman. Okay? So this is what we call case law. So, in the Bible you have things like the 10 Commandments, right? And we've just had those in Exodus 20. So the 10 Commandments gives the big categories. And one of those categories is do not murder. And we realize if we really think through this, that do not murder actually is more than don't take a 9mm pistol and kill someone with it. It includes that, but it's bigger than that. It's also the idea, it's really the idea, don't take life from another individual. And so that's what Jesus is doing in the Sermon on the Mount when he says, you've heard it said, do not murder. I say to you, how does he put that? Do not be angry with your brother. Do not, empty-headed. Don't call someone an idiot. Because if you do that, you've broken the law against murder. Now, does that mean that insulting someone is equal to killing someone with a knife or a gun? No. I hear a lot of Christians say things like that. That all sin is sin and all sin is equally sinful. That is not true. Now, all sin is sin, and all sin will send you to hell, okay? But not all sin is equal. And the Bible makes these distinctions. The Bible says, if you commit adultery in the Old Testament, what do they do to you? They stone you. It's a capital crime. If, to contemporize it, there's two teenagers in the back seat of the car and she gets pregnant, what do they do to you? They don't stone you, okay? It's not morally innocent either, right? It's either you get married or it says something like this. If the father of the girl highly objects, there's some other punishment. But there's a distinction here. Adultery is a capital crime in the Old Testament. A passionate moment isn't. And so we're to understand that there's a law of murder, and there's a lot of things that fit into this category of the law of murder, and they're all wrong and they're all sinful, but they're not equally sinful. Okay? So that's the big category, and then what you have in the Old Testament so often, in this passage, you have specific examples in real life scenarios. And some of these really do come out of real life. These people are living in the wilderness, and this situation happens, and they come to Moses and say, how do we deal with this? And so he'll attach it somehow to the law of God, but this is a case. This is a specific instance. And that's probably how we're to think of this. So when men strive together and they hit a pregnant woman. So you got two men and somehow, it comes to fisticuffs. Now, how's the pregnant woman get hit? We could speculate, couldn't we? She's trying to protect her man. That would seem like a real possibility. So I'm suggesting that this could have been a real situation. This is not a hypothetical. In the wilderness, something like this probably happened. So this woman intervenes, or she's just collateral damage for whatever reason, because in the ancient world they realized something that we've forgotten, that men are stronger than women, and there is a difference between men and women. Okay? So she gets hit, and it says, so that her children come out, but there is no harm. So in other words, she's hit, and it causes what do we call this? What's that? A premature birth, yes. And it says her children come out. I don't know if this is a specific situation. Maybe she was carrying twins, but whatever. Whether it's one or boy, girls, one or two, whatever. the child comes out early, but there is no other harm. In other words, child and mother, they did fine. Okay? The one who hit her shall surely be fined, as the husband shall impose on him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. So he is morally responsible, right? Because he's violated the law against murder. Not that there's been a death, but there has been harm done to life. Okay? Oh, he hit her, hurt her, and could have hurt the children. Okay? But then it says, verse 23, but if there is harm, then you shall pay life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. Now, what do we call that principle? We call it justice, right? Punishment befitting of the crime. That's called justice. And so, I don't know exactly how this was played out in the Old Covenant world, but it seems to me what the text is saying, if the baby dies, then it's now in a different category, and it's treated differently than if the baby comes out premature and mom and child do fine. And justice here would see, if you apply this the way it would seem to suggest, it would seem like the man could lose his life because he's guilty of physical murder.
Well, mine says, verse 23 says that there's no any further injury. It doesn't say about dying. To me, it's just, well, the first act is may not cause further injury, and he just pays for it. But for any further injury after that, then he pays.
Yeah. So this is an interesting text, and again, it is a text like this becomes disputed in part because the implications of this are significant. All right, well, let's go on. Psalm 51 and verse 5. You remember Psalm 51? It's that Psalm of David when he confesses his sin with Bathsheba. And what an interesting period that was in David's life. I have read scholars, and I don't know, I cannot trace out how they make this determination, but I'll share it with you. I've read scholars who argue that during the period of time when David sins with Bathsheba until Psalm 51, David doesn't write any psalms. Now again, I don't know how they exactly come to that conclusion. But what we do know, of course, is that Nathan the prophet is sent by God, and Nathan comes and he tells that little story about the man who had the lamb. Remember that story? And then David gets angry. And Nathan is so wise in how he does this because, David was a king. If you got the king angry, that could be really bad for your future. This wasn't like the Queen of England, who's just sort of figurehead monarch. David had power over life and death of his subjects. Probably we should think that with Bathsheba, it's more of a rape than it is a consensual relationship, at least initially. I mean, he took this woman. It's not like she could look at the king and say, I don't want to do this. He is king. So we don't understand this, what it means to be a monarch. And where we really, I think, lose something is that we have a modern idea of being a king. We think of the Queen of England, or we think of Republican democracy, where everybody gets a vote and everybody has a say, and we raise hands and we count. And we take that and we apply that when we read that God is a king. And we don't understand what that means. It means that God is authority. Utter authority. Okay? So David is the king, and Nathan is doing something exceedingly dangerous. And so he disarms David by allowing David to convict himself through that parable. But so it's like Nathan comes and brings David to repentance. And then David, in that brokenness, gives us Psalm 51, which I think has been a tremendous benefit to the church and to so many people because, you know, what is required to be a member of a church? What do you have to acknowledge? You're a sinner, right? I mean, Christians are accused all the time of being the hypocrites in the modern world, but we at least have to acknowledge we're sinners saved by grace, so you can't be part of us. So we need, this is a comforting medicine to us because it reminds us that God is gracious. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love, according to your abundant mercy, blot out my transgressions. Now, what did we say earlier about in the Old Testament if you commit adultery? What's the crime for that? Death by stoning. Now, David is king, but he's not above the Mosaic law. Okay? So you realize the grace that is shown to David in all of this. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity, cleanse me from my sin, for I know my transgression. My sin is ever before me. Against you, you only have I sinned, done what is evil in your sight. But then verse 5, behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. Now, I simply mention that because, well, I think what it's teaching. I do not think this is saying that David's parents had some sort of illicit relationship and David was the result of that. I don't think that's the point. I think actually David is saying something here that the Apostle Paul would really agree with. And that is David is acknowledging that he's a sinner from before birth in the sense of having a sin nature. Not to say he's actually sinned. I mean, he's in his mother's womb. He hasn't made a conscious choice to sin. But we are sinners by nature and by choice. And you know, Paul teaches that quite clearly. I think that's what he's saying here. But he's acknowledging that, you know, within his mother's womb, he's just not a collection of cells. That he's viewing himself as a human being who is a fallen human being. Okay? I just read it for that reason. Jeremiah chapter 1 and verse 5. This is the call of Jeremiah. So this is God speaking about Jeremiah. He says, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations. Okay? A passage that would be somewhat similar to that. It's the last one on the list, but I'll read it now. Luke chapter 1. This is the only New Testament text. Luke chapter 1, verse 41. So this is John the Baptist. I'll start reading in verse 39. In those days Mary arose and went with haste into the hill country to a town in Judah, and she entered the house of Zechariah and greeted Elizabeth. And when Elizabeth heard the greeting of Mary, the baby leapt in her womb. And Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Spirit. And she exclaimed with a loud voice, "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb." And isn't that an interesting text? I mean, John the Baptist, in his mother's womb, responds to the presence of Mary, the mother of Jesus. Any other thoughts on that? Yeah, and so all these scriptures, what we're trying to just simply do is to try to have a better understanding of what is a Christian worldview when it comes to the preborn child. How does the Bible speak about the preborn person? And it uses words like children and so forth.
So in Jeremiah, does that mean that he knows everybody, or is that just specific to Jeremiah? When he says, before I formed you, I knew you, does that mean that he knows every single individual ever born, that ever will be born, or is this specifically spoken to of Jeremiah?
Well, I think it's...
Or how do we apply that in just everybody's life?
You'd apply it, first of all, by saying, I think there's two answers to your... God is omniscient, and so the word omniscient means that God knows all things, and God's knowledge is exhaustive. Now, years ago, in the CB movement, there was, years ago, like 15 years ago, I remember this, I was pastoring here, there was the open theism issue. And to make a long story short, open theism is the viewpoint that God does not know exhaustively the future. And the reason that appealed to some pastors in our movement was that they felt that it absolved God of responsibility for the bad things that happen in this world. So after church today, some of you who live in Hermiston, you might be driving back into Hermiston, so now you need to be careful since I'm saying this. Be careful when you drive past Denny's, because there's been a number of wrecks there, right? Where someone comes out and they T-bone someone on the road, and there's been people died that way. There was this Stanfield father who died a couple years ago. He didn't have a seatbelt on, and he exited the vehicle and was killed. So the open theism folks said, well, God didn't know that was going to happen. And so God's not responsible in any sense for that tragedy. Now, the problem with that is that it's unbiblical. It denies the omniscience of God. The other problem with that is that when the doctor calls you and says, you have cancer, all of a sudden you realize that you're not in control of your life, that you are the passenger in the car called your life. And in that moment, you look at the driver's seat and you ask the question, who's driving the car in the midst of my cancer? And the open theist says, nobody is. And the biblical Christian says, God is. And this is hard, and I don't understand it. But I'm in the hands of God in the midst of my cancer. That's a lot more comforting than open theism. So, just a second, Don. So the association rejected that position. And not Wayne Grudem, Bruce Ware from Southern Seminary, and Gary Beshears, David's dad, crafted the doctrinal statement that we run under, and it addresses that issue specifically. So that's the first thing I would say, that does God know all things, comprehensively? Yes. If he doesn't, he's not God. Okay? But then Dawn had her hand up. So I gotta let Dawn speak, because you did not raise your hand. And then I've got something else to say about what Larry's comment, which I think needs to be said as well. Okay, Dawn.
So if you jump down to the next verse, Jeremiah doesn't say, alas, God. He says, alas, sovereign Lord.
Yeah.
So to me, that gives more evidence. He doesn't just say God.
Yeah.
He says sovereign.
Yeah, so this is one of those things. I've said this many times. Okay, we're getting into God's sovereignty and human decision making. This is a good illustration. Put your fingers, latch them together. You got two elbows. This one is God is sovereign. This one is I make morally significant decisions. You better hold those two in tension. That's what I'm doing right now. I'm holding these in tension. If I break the tension, I'm a heretic. Okay? Or here's another example, Trinity. God is one in essence and three in person. I better hold that in tension. If I break that tension, I'm either a Unitarian or a Mormon. Okay, so you got to hold these deep truths in tension. These are things our minds cannot fully fathom, but we dare not reject them. Okay, the other thing I was going to say, Larry, I do think that this is, I don't object to saying that in some sense this is unique to Jeremiah, because Jeremiah is clearly, for reasons known only to God, he plays a particularly prominent, important role in the history of redemption. And that God set this man apart to be a prophet of God, or that God set Paul apart to be an apostle. And he did not set us apart to be apostles. That's also true in this. And so in that sense, I think that this is a unique call to Jeremiah. I'm not sure that other people have this same kind of call.
Pastor John, there's two passages in the New Testament that do say that before time began, God set us up for what he wanted.
Yeah.
One is, of course, Ephesians 2,
Mm-hmm.
10, and then also 2 Timothy 1:9, who has saved us and called us with a holy calling, not according to our works, but according to his own purpose and grace, which was given to us in Christ Jesus before time began. So we have two references that say not only was Jeremiah called before time, but so
We're running out of time. Isn't this fun? We've gotten to some deeper theological issues today, but that's good. But I do want to just read one more text, and then the Proverbs text, basically, you should read that one. I'll let you read that on your own. It's basically, it's summoning people to say, if you know something's wrong and you don't do anything about it, you bear responsibility. Okay? But the Psalm 139 passage, this is probably the go-to text when you're thinking on these issues. And I'll just read a couple of verses. There's a lot more that we could read. I remember listening to Ron Allen, who was a Hebrew professor at Western Seminary, talk through this passage and really dissect the Hebrew words used here and how so many of these words came out of their world of the sorts of things that Claire Betancourt does, or that a number of you do in terms of knitting or tatting or artistic work that is beautiful and delicate and difficult. And then that kind of language is applied here to God. So God is the divine artist. And so the womb of the woman is this sacred place where God, the divine artist, is at work. And so just a couple of verses. Psalm 139, verse 13. For you formed my inward parts and knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, my soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. And so I think the womb here is being compared to the earth. I mean, you plant a seed in the ground and you water that seed and something amazing happens. An oak tree grows or a beautiful flower grows. And my wife is always reminding me of how amazing all of that is. And it is amazing. But to think here a woman's womb is this sacred place where God is at work and God is creating life. And so God has given us many rights, but he hasn't given us the right to end life within a woman's womb. So those are the biblical texts. Next week we'll make, I think, more progress in terms of getting through these notes. We're going to look at where do rights come from, what are pre-political rights, and I want to spend some time really trying to understand the feminist argument. How do they justify abortion? And again, I think that the LGBTQ stuff is small potatoes compared to abortion. Abortion is the major moral issue in our culture. The only thing that compares to abortion in American history is slavery. It's the only true analogy. And it's why abortion just doesn't ever go away. You know, when the 73 decision was made, cultural elites thought, well, it's over now, it's settled. It's not settled, because we're talking about human life and the right to life. All right, so we'll move in the other room where there's some air conditioning.